Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
This week marks the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, the historic deal that started a new chapter for Northern Ireland. Tony Blair sees it as one of his proudest achievements, but it wouldn't have been possible without the commitment of the White House. Bill Clinton sent one of his closest friends and advisers, Senator George Mitchell, to broker the deal. And I spoke to Senator Mitchell earlier and asked if the Good Friday Agreement had stood the test of time. I put it to him that some critics say it's getting in the way of political progress in Northern Ireland now, where the Assembly has been suspended for the past year.
I don't agree with that analysis. I think the people espousing that line are primarily concerned with the Brexit debate in the UK and are using the Northern Ireland issue as a part of that debate. I believe that the single most important result of the Good Friday Agreement has been 20 years of peace, and surely no one would disagree with that. Thousands of people who otherwise might have been killed are still alive today as a consequence of the courage and vision of the political leaders of Northern Ireland and of the UK and Ireland back in 1998 when they reached this agreement.
You mentioned Brexit there, Senator. The British government says that it's given two really good practical options to avoid a hard border, and the ball is therefore in the court of the EU or the Irish government.
Well, I don't want to get involved in the details of the negotiations to which I am not a party and therefore not fully informed. But it is clear that the UK and the EU reached agreement and publicly said there would not be a hard border. The difficulty, as always, is in doing what you've agreed to do. That's always harder, and I think they're working on that now, and I hope they will figure out a way to resolve it that maintains the border in the current status, because that's been an important factor in reducing the stereotyping and the demonization that existed between Northern Ireland and Ireland before, when people who lived just a short distance from the border never crossed it.
Because of what you achieved in the late 1990s, you have, Senator, a considerable amount of moral authority. With that in mind, what's your message for Theresa May and the Taoiseach?
What I do urge them is to recognize what's at stake here. It's the futures of their economies, it's the possibility of resumption of conflict or of a reversion back to a time when nobody wants to go back to except for a very tiny fringe element on both sides. And I think that means they have to come up with reasonable and acceptable compromise.
Are you still an optimist?
I am indeed. I don't think there's any human problem that can't be solved with the right amount of goodwill and courage. I'll just say one thing to you about negotiations. I think it was F.D. de Klerk of South Africa who once said that the really tough part of negotiations is not when you are facing your opponent across the table. The really tough negotiations are after you reach agreement there and you have to return back to your party or your community to tell them they're not going to get 100% of what they want, and you have to have the courage and the strength to withstand their attacks and criticism. A tough part for any leader is to negotiate a fair deal and then to go back and persuade his or her supporters that this is best for them as well.
Wise words. Senator George Mitchell, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Andrew.
And listening to that, here in the studio, we've got Ireland's ambassador to the UK, Adrian O'Neill, and the actor Adrian Dunbar, star, of course, of Line of Duty. Can I start with you, Ambassador? You heard George Mitchell there. We were talking about the Irish border, very sensitive moment for this. The British government has made it absolutely clear that under no circumstances are they going to put physical border posts in. If Brussels says to the Irish government, but this is the border of the EU as well, are there any circumstances in which Dublin would actually create a physical border?
Well, Andrew, I think we welcome the fact very much that in her Mansion House speech, the Prime Minister said that it was the decision of the UK to leave the European Union, and therefore the UK has a responsibility to help find a solution to the problem on the border. And there is agreement all round between the EU and the UK that there will be no hard border on the island of Ireland, and that includes any physical infrastructure.
So there's no way that Dublin would
Well,
border
I think the question, the issue now is, we know what the UK and the EU 27 know what we want to achieve. The question is, how do we do that, and how is that best done? And there are negotiations going on even this week in Brussels, which will be addressing the how and the modalities and so on. And I think, you know, we need to work through that to get to the destination that we all want to achieve.
Adrian Dunbar, you're the scary one in Line of Duty. You're the enforcer, but you were brought up in Northern Ireland during the years of the Troubles. Yeah. Right at the beginning of the programme, I mentioned Seamus Heaney's great poem, The Cure of Troy, which is quoted by everybody in part as the kind of key to what happened. But you can now, I think, read for us the actual thing.
I certainly will, Andrew.
Thank you very much indeed.
Human beings suffer. They torture one another. They get hurt and get hard. No poem or play or song can fully right a wrong inflicted and endured. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave. But then, once in a lifetime, the longed-for tidal wave of justice can rise up, and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells. Call miracle self-healing the utter self-revealing double take of feeling. If there's fire on the mountain and lightning and storm and a God speaks from the sky, that means someone is hearing the outcry and the birth cry of a new term at its life. It means once in a lifetime that justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme.
It's a wonderful piece of writing. Thank you very much indeed. And you've both been involved in these events in London and I think in the future in Belfast, where you're using music and poetry to commemorate
tomorrow night in Belfast, yes. The further show, the quote from the piece itself, actors, musicians have come together to commemorate the Good Friday Agreement, the template for peace going forward.
What were your sort of personal memories of that period?
Well, you know, I'm from Enniskillen. Yes, and of course we've had our tragedies, of course, and so this Good Friday Agreement was greeted with great happiness and euphoria as a template for peace and, you know, parity esteem going forward. And a lot of people would say we're in this impasse at the moment because we haven't applied the Good Friday Agreement, you know, implemented it, so forth. So, you know, we'd like to get back to that.
A little bit of tension and so forth. Very briefly, Ambassador, can I ask you whether you think the Good Friday Agreement is now in jeopardy?
I don't, because I don't think there's any other alternative. I mean, in many senses, we're not really commemorating the Good Friday Agreement. We're reaffirming its indispensability. It is the most comprehensive agreement ever reached in Northern Ireland, endorsed overwhelmingly by people in both parts of the island, 71% in Northern Ireland, 94% in the south. So it's the people's agreement. So I think it's the essential template, and I think its principles and commitments are as equally valid now as they were in 1998.
And on that same slightly upbeat note, I may be wrong about this, but I think Line of Duty is actually filmed in Northern Ireland.
It is.
A lot of it.
Have
you noticed a kind of really encouraging change in atmosphere as you've been filming?
It's absolutely unbelievable, Andrew. You know what's happened to Belfast since this agreement, you know, has been signed. Yeah. And you know we can't lose that. We really can't lose that.
All right. Thank you to both my brace of Adrians, Niall and Dunbar. Thanks very much indeed.
20 years ago this coming week, the Good Friday Agreement was signed, a historic achievement that few would have thought possible in the darkest days of the Troubles. But the deal faces new challenges, with the breakdown of power-sharing in Stormont and the threats of a hard border post-Brexit. Well, this week I sat down with the Irish ambassador to the UK, Adrian O'Neill, and started by asking him just how significant the agreement was.
Well, I think it was an amazing achievement, really, in some senses kind of nearly miraculous. Seamus Heaney's famous poem, A Cure at Troy, talks about, you know, believe a further shore can be reached from here, believe in miracles. And I think in some senses that was, the Good Friday Agreement was kind of our miracle after, you know, the horror of the 30 years that preceded it, the 3,500 deaths, not just in Northern Ireland, but, you know, also in Ireland, the rest of the island, and indeed here in Britain as well. A number of places were scarred by the violence emanating from Northern Ireland. I think to have an agreement like that was such a comprehensive agreement that addressed all of the key issues that needed to be addressed, and that has given us essentially peace on the streets in Northern Ireland ever since, I think is a remarkable achievement and something which I think we definitely need to mark and celebrate.
So how then was it possible to bring people with such diverging views of the future of Northern Ireland round the table and bring about that peace? I mean, how was that achieved?
Well, I think it was achieved by various people, you know, taking risks for peace and being willing to take those steps that were necessary to reach out to the other side. And I think the fact that the two governments, the British and Irish government, working so closely together, particularly, you know, personified by the really good relationship that existed between Bertie Ahern, the then Taoiseach, and Prime Minister Blair, the two governments working together offered a process to people. A process in which they could come to the table and bring their grievances, but also bring their aspirations, and through a democratic process, have those worked out and see if an agreement could be reached. And I think it was the offering of that inclusive peace process, supported and guaranteed by the two governments. I think that was the crucial ingredient.
And yet there are those, including former Northern Ireland secretaries, who suggest that at this point in time the Good Friday Agreement is no longer fit for purpose.
Well, I would profoundly disagree with that analysis, and so would the Irish government. I mean, it's really important to remember that the Good Friday Agreement wasn't just an agreement that was made by a number of political parties on a given day. It's an agreement that was also became an international treaty subscribed to by the British and Irish governments, and that treaty still applies. It's a formal international treaty at the United Nations. And crucially, there was a referendum in both parts of Ireland on the agreement, and the full text of the agreement was made available to every household in the country. And something like 71% of people in Northern Ireland voted for the agreement in that referendum, and 94% of people in the south of Ireland voted for that agreement. So, I mean, I think it has a status and a solemnity that I think can't be gainsaid.
I mean, bringing an end to the violence in Northern Ireland, I mean, as you say, thousands were killed, tens of thousands were injured. That in and of itself is no small achievement. But doesn't the collapse of the power sharing agreement at Stormont, doesn't that show to an extent that the ultimate aim, reconciliation, is still some distance away?
Well, I think even back in 1998, those of us who would have derived huge hope and a sense of optimism from the agreement and from what was achieved would have realised that the job of reconciliation in Northern Ireland is a long-term task that's going to take several generations, because you don't. I mean, Northern Ireland is a legacy of a very troubled history between our two islands. And, you know, given the number of deaths that occurred, the hurt that was inflicted, you know, one political agreement isn't going to suddenly kind of remove all of that. The hurt that has to be addressed is a long-term process of reconciliation that's going to take generations. I
mean, clearly the problems in Northern Ireland at the moment predate Brexit by some margin, but it has made things rather more complicated. Are you of the opinion, and some people seem to be, that a hard border between the Republic and Northern Ireland would necessarily lead to a return to violence?
Well, I mean, I don't want to be accused in any way of subscribing to Project Fear by making some kind of prediction that would be the case. But what I would say is that I think, and I mean, I think this is universally recognised, that you know, a hard border in Northern Ireland would certainly subvert a lot of the progress that we have made in recent years. It certainly would not be conducive to the long-term project of reconciliation. It would again divide communities who live along the border. I think it would disturb the process of normalisation and integration in the island that has been going on since the Good Friday Agreement, in terms of the economic integration, the social integration, the cultural integration, the sense that you have now, that people have whether you live in Northern Ireland or the south of Ireland, we're so much more comfortable now travelling up and down and with no obstacles, ease of travel, ease of movement. And all of that would be disturbed in a very unhelpful way by any prospect of a hard border on the island.
Just in terms of the historic legacy of the Good Friday Agreement, as we said before, there is a generation that has grown up not knowing the violence. But is that perhaps part of the problem, that there is this generation who do not understand just how dark those days were, that there isn't the domestic pressure perhaps on DUP, Sinn Féin, others, to actually get this sorted out and get everything back on track?
Well, I'd say that, I think in fairness, I would say to those people in the DUP and Sinn Féin and in their negotiating teams, I mean, a lot of them have been, around a long time. I mean, they themselves were, would have grown up and would have been young politicians during some of the dark days. So, I think they're very, very conscious of the dark place from where we've all come, and I think they're very, very determined that we not go back there. And I think at the moment, yes, there are difficulties in the political relationships in Northern Ireland. I think which have caused some damage in terms of trust and confidence between the parties, and there are issues, difficult issues around identity and culture and so forth, which they have yet not found a way to bridge. And I think it's the task of the two governments, I think, working together and consulting with each other now to think, okay, well, how can we help those parties find a way through these issues that allows them to get these institutions back up and running as soon as possible.
Are you confident that they will?
I think I am confident, because, to be honest with you, I don't think there is really any other choice. I think there are no alternative options. I mean, direct rule is something which both governments, the Irish government and the UK government, both recognise would be very much a step backwards in relation to Northern Ireland, and that the only way forward is a power sharing devolved government in Northern Ireland. And I think that the two governments are working closely together, reflecting and consulting, and how can we best assist the parties to get back to the table in a way that this time delivers the prospect of a positive outcome.
The Irish ambassador to the United Kingdom, Adrian O'Neill there.
Well, on Tuesday, it will be 20 years since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in Belfast. Actually, there were two agreements, one between the British and the Irish governments, the other between the two governments and the 8 political parties or groupings in Northern Ireland. Now, it's brought about power sharing at Stormont. It formally recognised that the majority of people in Northern Ireland wished to remain part of the United Kingdom. It had also formally recognised that the majority of the people in the Republic of Ireland and a substantial minority in Northern Ireland wished to bring about a united Ireland. It set up institutions and frameworks to handle matters within Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and between Great Britain and the Republic of Ireland. It led to the decommissioning of weapons held by the various paramilitary groups and the normalisation after 30 years of the troubles of security arrangements within Northern Ireland. It was and is a big deal in every sense of the word. At the time, it was signed, both the UK and the Republic of Ireland were the members of the European Union, and nobody then contemplated a change in that situation. But that situation has changed. Now the island of Ireland is to be half in the European Union and half out. And there will have to be changes in treaties and border rules and regulations agreed with all parties. Is peace in Northern Ireland under threat? Well, Brian, there you are. There's a lot of explaining that, but it's a complicated old issue, this. It's such an important issue because it's the biggest change, isn't it? Brexit. How worried are you?
I'm quite worried, and I think you're absolutely right to say the Good Friday Agreement was a big deal. It brought an end to 30 years of violent political conflict, and from a human rights point of view, that means a bonfire of human rights. So when something ends conflict like that, then it's worth defending. But it was a very complex deal. It was a deal that was designed to allow people with different national allegiances, not just aspirations, to share the same political and geographical space.
So how has Brexit affected things?
Well, because the agreement was based on trust. Trust that the people of the whole island could exercise their right to self-determination without external impediment. Trust that the people of Northern Ireland could decide their constitutional future. Trust that the birthright to be Irish or British or both would mean equal citizenship rights. Trust that there would not be one community in a position to dominate the other. And also trust that we would have a rights-based society.
And that is all under threat?
All of those were guaranteed in the agreement, and all are under threat by Brexit and the political fallout from it.
I think Brian ought to take a cold shower. There are three things. There is the agreement between London and Dublin. That's why I call it the Belfast Agreement. It's a bilateral treaty.
What's wrong with the Good Friday Agreement? It's one of the greatest political achievements in this country for 70 years, wasn't it?
I'm not a believer, and therefore I don't wish to invoke religious terminology when discussing secular matters. Secondly, religious terminology is used by Irish republicanism, the Easter Rising in 1916. The agreement was signed by Tony Blair and Bertie Ahern in Belfast, call it the Belfast Agreement. We have something called the Dublin Convention, because it was signed in Dublin. We have the Geneva Protocols. They were signed in Geneva.
How many lives has it saved?
It has not stopped violence, but it has stopped the paramilitary violence that did proceed for 30 years.
And the violence of the state.
The IRA dumped its arms in 2005, not in 1997. The Loyalists have sort of followed suit.
Has it saved lives?
It has saved lives, yes.
And I mean, I think it's important to say that it's saved lives in the context of over 3,500 people died out of a population of 1.5 million, the same population as a medium-sized city in the UK, which, if you extrapolated that to the whole UK, is more than all civilians that died in the Second World War. So it's a big deal, and it's saved lives. And what's more, it's reformed the state. I mentioned state violence there. We now have a reformed police service which attempts at least to put human rights at the centre of practical operational policing. It is absolutely worth defending, and Brexit undermines all those aspects of trust that I listed earlier.
What are you going to do about the border?
With Brexit, I voted Remain. I accept the result of the referendum, and I hope everyone puts their shoulder to the wheel and makes sure we get a good deal. Brexit will not create a problem on the Irish border that is not solvable. However, the European Commission in Brussels is very opportunistically using the Irish border. Why? Not because they're concerned about the Irish border, but because they were originally concerned with trying to get the UK to reverse its position after the referendum.
What about the practicalities? What about the practicalities of solving the border situation? OK, you've got a widget on one side, has to go north to be attached to a bigger widget, then it has to go back south, there's a bigger widget there, and you've got to pay. How's that work?
That border is a common border between the Republic of Ireland and the UK. They start by sitting down together and solving that border problem. They are not doing it because the Irish have decided they're going to support Brussels against the UK. When we see London and Dublin sit down, the border will be solved. It is a smart border. It's a technological solution. The head of customs in Sweden, in a report for the European Parliament, said, yes, you can have an invisible border.
That Carlson report that you referred to, Austin, didn't say you can have a smart border only. So there will be a staff border. There's going to be a reinvigorated border, which, as we heard from Brian a moment or two ago, over which 3,600 people died. It's reckless to reinvigorate a border, even whether we call it a hard border or a soft border. And we can't be too complacent. I don't think for 1 minute there's going to be a return to full-scale violence, but the official threat level is severe.
What's bubbling under with Republican violence? What's going on?
The official threat level is severe. More than 2,000 shootings and bombing incidents since the Good Friday Agreement. The worst atrocity of the whole Troubles after the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement only brought about an imperfect peace.
Is this on both sides, loyalist and Republican? It's
mainly on the Republican side, but not exclusively. And also Brexiters deepen the divisions, as if they weren't deep enough between Unionists and Nationalists. 88% of Nationalists voted to remain in the European Union. There was a reason for that. They'll accept the border as a soft political fact in the short and medium term, notwithstanding the long-term aspiration for United Ireland, but they're not going to accept it as a reinvigorated border that is a fence, electronic or otherwise.
There will not be much change on the border for anyone who lives either side of it. There will not be the security border of the Troubles reimposed when the majority of roads were actually closed.
Well, Victoria, you've done so much work on this, haven't you?
Well, that's right, and I think it's not quite right to describe the current border as simply a soft political fact. It is a real border. It's a real border for many regulatory and legislative matters. It's a tax border for excise duty and for VAT. And really what we talk about when we talk about introducing a customs border is it's a matter of indirect tax. And we are talking about having, hopefully not, we will hopefully have a free trade agreement where no tariffs will apply between the UK and the whole of the EU.
Hopefully, you say.
I'm very optimistic about that. I think it's very
strong. And if we don't?
If we don't, then the fact still remains that there will be customs administration, whether or not we have a tariff-free trade agreement. So the question is, how do we minimise the administrative burdens and reduce the amount of physical interventions? And in fact, the amount of physical interventions on a customs border that we have already with the rest of the world is tiny. 96% of all goods come into the UK without having a physical check at the border.
So we're getting our knickers in a twist about nothing here, aren't we?
It's not about nothing. It is a serious matter and it needs to be worked on very hard by all parties. But we are talking about making a process for collecting and administrating an indirect tax as straightforward and seamless as possible.
Not a single vehicle is checked going across the border at the moment. Can you guarantee that that won't be the case after Brexit?
Actually, the head of HMRC in the UK has said he's confident that that can be done. He's said that he's on the record of saying that to a committee in Parliament, and in fact the Irish Revenue Commission.
So even though Norway, Sweden can't do it, and France, Switzerland can't do it, and Turkey, Bulgaria can't do it, Ireland will be different. You're confident?
Yes, I am confident, as is John Thompson, head of HMRC, as were the Irish Revenue Commissioners themselves until a few months ago. They had said nothing needed to be done on the border, inspections could be done away from the border, as is done with 99%.
A licence to smuggle. Already, if you look at where there are differences in duties across that border, like fuel and on tobacco, huge smuggling operations.
What about people as well coming through? People smuggling and also
that's protected by the common travel area. I mean, the only way forward is to have a common trade area, a UK island-wide deal, if the European Union will allow that, which would circumvent a lot of the problems that we're talking about. But otherwise, if you've got a staff border, it is potentially dangerous. Those are not my words. The Chief Constable of Northern Ireland said a hard border, that basically installations will be attacked. The Police Federation of Northern Ireland, and I quote, said that customs officials will be sitting ducks.
Can I also raise a question? You mentioned people crossing the border.
Yes.
There is a danger that if the Irish border, whatever form it takes after Brexit, if Brexit occurs, will be seen as porous. And that for all kinds of immigration.
That was my point, yeah.
If the common travel area continues to exist, then people who are Irish or British should not have to show passports, which is a clear invitation to racial profiling in terms of immigration checks.
That's not how
and
it
we are
works.
particularly concerned
that
the whole of Northern Ireland could be turned into one big border. The immigration enforcement has already promised enhanced immigration enforcement.
Victoria doesn't agree with you.
That it has convicted the first 3 people in the United Kingdom of the crime of illegal working in the Northern Ireland jurisdiction, and it promises more enhanced immigration enforcement.
Victoria.
That's not what the Good Friday Agreement
That's not the way the Common
promised.
Travel Area works. The way the Common Travel Area works is that once you are within that Common Travel Area, once you've had your passport checked, whether that's coming into London or coming into Dublin, whichever nationality you are, you don't need to have your passport checked when you cross the Irish land border. And that's irrespective of Brexit. That's something that will continue. There's no change there. There are immigration issues with it. There have been in the past issues of immigrants who are not permitted into the United Kingdom trying to use the land border as a back door. It's very small numbers, but nothing about Brexit will change that.
All right, does Brexit threaten the Irish peace, the Irish border? Any thoughts in the audience? I'd like to come to this gentleman over here. Good morning, the microphone is coming your way and it's there.
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning.
I thought the argument here was, or the debate here was will it encourage violence? Yet most of the debate is about Brexit. We've had the argument about Brexit, we've had the referendum. Why on earth would the political situation in Ireland encourage violence in the religious parts of Ireland, which it was before?
Anyone want to explain the situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, because
the
point is that you've got a historic agreement between people who see themselves not just as Protestant or Catholic, but as Irish or British. That constitutional settlement is put at threat. The right to self-determination is enshrined in the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah.
All these political certainties are throwing it up in the air. We're talking about a slow corrosion.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
He sounds like a Remainer who's agreed because the vote went against him.
He is a Remainer, and the vote did go against him. The Belfast,
not in Northern Ireland.
The Belfast Agreement is not Moses' tablets of stone. You call it the Good Friday Agreement.
I don't think you like religious terms.
You shouldn't push into it everything you favour. The common travel area is a key solution to the border problem, but it has to be solved by London and Dublin together. They basically would work jointly controlling immigration into the common travel area, including immigration from the European Union.
Well, if you think you're going to involve UK immigration,
Strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement, as you know, makes numerous references to the European Union. What would you do about rewriting those references? Would you simply delete them? This is an agreement which has been voted for by the people, both North and South. Would you simply Tipex all those references to the European Union and its influence on all-Ireland policy, which was important
the Belfast Agreement is not Moses' tablets of stone. The world changes, the agreement has to function differently. On North-South, the only thing that will be affected is a special EU spending body, which was created under Strand 2. Now, that body will fall away, so there will be another body put in its place. We suggested some time ago that European body could actually become the border body to jointly control the border.
This issue of sovereignty, which seems to be, for some people, it's absolutely at the heart of their belief and their outlook and their worldview. For others, it's all a bit sort of abstract and notional. It's very important in Northern Ireland, but it seems to have trumped, some people argue, some of the best interests of those who actually voted to maintain it and voted to Brexit. Some of the agricultural problems that will follow in the wake of Brexit are going to be huge for some of the very people that voted for Brexit. And there may well be the result that some people say it's going to actually ultimately drift Northern Ireland away from the United Kingdom. And that's the last thing that some of the people who voted for Brexit want. Sorry, that wasn't a question, it was a speech.
This is true. I mean, you've got DUP supporting farmers who are going to lose 60% of their income because they lose all their farm subsidies. But ultimately, yeah, you're right. I mean, sovereignty trumps everything else. In terms of Northern Ireland drifting away from the United Kingdom, well, the European Union has made clear they want special status for Northern Ireland. That would also be Sinn Féin's position. But I don't think they're going to get that, because which Conservative government beholden to the DUP at Westminster is going to try and risk special status for Northern Ireland?
Anyways, yes, sir, a white jumper. Cream jumper. Hello. Yeah.
Sure.
Sure, you're on.
When I was a young man, I would have said that points of principle were the most important thing. And so when I was a young man, I would have agreed with that gentleman over there who said, we had a vote and we should stand by it. But I'm older and wiser now, and I've seen a few things. And I have seen personally 2 families who had absolutely no skin in the game in the Northern Irish conflict, basically destroyed. And yeah, we can talk about large statistics of 3,500 people killed, but I know some of those people who were killed, and they had nothing to do with any of it. They were just killed. And I have to say, having seen the absolute devastation that was wrought in 2 families, that no point of principle is worth human lives. It just isn't. And this is a horribly difficult problem, that Northern Irish border, which will soon cease to be a border between two nations and will become a border between a trading bloc and the rest of that. But it's not worth it. It really is not worth it. You cannot think that points of principle are more important, and you can't adopt a top-down approach and say, oh, well, this should work. It's not going to be like that. What you have to do is say, no, we have to work out what can possibly avoid a return to that bloodshed and work up from there. And I tell you now, deciding on points of principle and, oh, we had a vote, that's not going to cut it. And deciding on, well, it should work, you know, that kind of border should work, that's not going to cut it. It has to be avoid the death, seriously.
I think it's important to say that...
This is the last word. I was tempted to give that member of the audience the last word, only because we're so out of time. We could not possibly, in the time left, do you justice, to give you justice to a proper, full and fully thought out through answer. Bit of filling there. Thank you all very much indeed. As always, debates continue online on Twitter. Back from New York next Sunday with a special on the National Health Service. Is it still fit for purpose? Join us for that. Have a great Sunday and thanks for watching.